I'd like to make three central points connected with what has been discussed, but also perhaps attempting to go beyond what we have talked about. The first, I do not think that the dominance of the United States as a manifestation of the unipolar world was an illusion. It is real. It expressed itself in very tangible ways. It impacted upon people. Millions suffered as a result of it. So I think this is an important point to understand. And I think in some ways, what's been happening the last 2 or 3 weeks, the question of Gaza and the ceasefire and so on, brings this issue to the forefront. What do I mean by this? You have a situation where many of the very important actors in the global arena, they all come together with a single demand: humanitarian ceasefire. Civil society groups, a number of states, a number of coalitions, they'd all come together. And yet, there's been no ceasefire. And there will not be a ceasefire, from what we can see. And that is because we are confronted by the reality of US power. It is the US power behind Israel. US power coupled with the power of certain European countries and others, including Japan, which has been quite vocal on this question. Now, this would be the real factor that we must keep in mind. So here we are witnessing this phenomenon before our very eyes, this tussle between the sentiments of the masses, of the people, of good people, struggle between morality on the one hand, used in the broadest sense of the term, and power. And in the end, power has won, for the time being at least. And I don't see that changing. So that's the first point I want to make. We have to keep that in mind. There is this reality that we deal with. But having said that, and this brings me to the second point, there's been constant attempts since the end of the Second World War in challenging this dominant power. In fact, we have witnessed, perhaps in the past, more powerful voices against this dominant power. What do I mean by this? If you look at what happened immediately after the Second World War, 49 onwards, 1949 onwards, the rise of communism and the Soviet Union and its allies and so on, there was a challenge to this dominant power of the United States. And then you had the emergence of the Third World, countries becoming independent, asserting themselves. That was a very powerful force, the entire non-aligned movement. So on the one hand, the Soviet bloc, on the other hand, the non-aligned movement. Very, very powerful. And don't forget that in the 1970s, it gave birth to something which was out of the ordinary. Countries of what we call the global south now, they were able to determine issues such as the new international information order, the new international economic order. They adopted resolutions that were accepted by a lot of people. They became a force. That is a very, very important development. I mean, nothing has happened in the last few years that can match those things that happened in the 70s. So in other words, the point I'm making is the second point, that there have been constant attempts to challenge this. They have not worked, and we have to ask why. There are many reasons, but I'd like to suggest that one of the reasons is something that we haven't really focused upon. It is the strength of neoliberal capitalism, the strength of that ideology, which is why, in the end, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons why the Soviet Union crumbled is because of the power of that ideology, and it has a certain power behind it. And if you look at why the assertion of the global south became weaker and weaker, the non-aligned movement, in a sense, became lost voice. And one of the reasons, again, is because of the economic system, capitalism. All these countries succumbed to that system. They adjusted to the system. They wanted to be part of that economic order. Of course, there are many other reasons, but this is certainly an important factor. So I think this is something that we have to keep in mind, which is why If I look at what Professor Wang had said about economic enterprises, activities, about seeking the economic path, as it were, I think there is a danger in this. If that means strengthening the dominant economic regime, if it means strengthening the sort of economic regime connected with profits and capital and powerful corporations and a consumer culture that goes with it, if this is what it means, I don't think we're going to see any change. China has become a powerful force in the economic sphere, partly because it has joined the crowd. And it is, in many ways, one of the most powerful forces behind global capitalism at the moment, whatever they may say about its ideology and all the rest. So this is something that we have to keep in mind, that this is not the way. Just succumbing to this ideology and the powerful forces behind this ideology, which many of us have done. And if I may add, even BRICS, if BRICS, again, a group of nation states coming together, do they provide an alternative? If you look at their individual economic systems, if you look at some of the things that they're pursuing, both at the regional and global level, BRICS perhaps doesn't offer an alternative. It is a challenge in a sense, insofar as nation states have come together and said, look, we don't want to accept your dominance, your political dominance, meaning by which US dominance. But on the other hand, a lot of them are following the same economic path. And so I don't know whether that is the answer, because there are fundamental economic issues facing people. This is where the people's perspective becomes quite different from the perspective of state actors and other conglomerates and other coalitions and so on. For instance, the growing gap between rich and poor, the concentration of power in the hands of the few, the dominance of what we call financial capitalism as a variety, as a form of global capitalism. Now, I think these are things that are not in the interest of ordinary people. But if we just join the crowd, it's not going to solve the problem. So, yes, there have been challenges, but we have to be very careful about the nature of these challenges too, what they really mean. Does it really offer a change? Does it really mean that something else is going to emerge? I'm not so sure. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. And that brings me to the last point that I want to make. In a situation like this, and I want to be optimistic, what can we do? I think there are certain glimmers of hope here and there, and these have been alluded to in the course of our discussion today. Take the United Nations. I think there must be a concerted attempt to strengthen the General Assembly and the office of the Secretary General. These things are there in the Charter already, but they have not been playing the role they should. The General Assembly is not just a question of taking a vote. Can't the General Assembly become a greater force for good? And if you think of what has happened over the last so many years, don't forget on a number of issues, starting with apartheid against South Africa, and later issues like Cuba, issues like Bosnia. The General Assembly had always voted in a very moral way. So what had happened just a few days ago, 120 votes, it is part of a particular trajectory. The General Assembly is able to vote that way. So the General Assembly offers some hope. And this is what we have to keep in mind. And the same thing with the Office of the Secretary General. There have been times when the Secretary General has been able to play an important role, depending on the individual, and bring about some changes here and there. So these are things that we should think about, rather than concentrate on getting rid of the veto, which is not going to happen, or changing the Security Council and so on. So the United Nations, not just the General Assembly and the General's Office, but the other agencies, I think one should push for changes along those lines. That would be one area that we should look at. Number two, I think it's equally important that we strengthen this notion of coalition building. BRICS is, in a sense, part of it. But I'm thinking more of something else that had happened in the past, the way in which the non-aligned movement emerged from the mid-50s onwards, and the role it played right up to the mid-70s. Now, that's the way to go to, nations to come together, have a very clear vision of what they want to do. And I think the global South has to assert itself. And as I've written in a recent article, I'm not talking of the global South per se, we have to think more and more in terms of the entire global community. For instance, I'd like to see, some of the countries in the north, the global north, an outstanding example. I was very impressed with this country, and I've always been impressed with this country. Is Ireland. Look at the stand that Ireland has taken on the question of Gaza and Palestine. That is the sort of moral stand that the global north is also capable of. So these countries, I think, should come together, build coalitions, try to bring about some change. And that would also help. And this leads me to yet another point that I want to make, that I think society as a whole, civil society, and we've seen this every now and then. And the best example was 2003, Iraq. There was mass mobilization. It was just amazing what had happened. Someone estimated that something like 50 million people were involved in different forms of protest in relation to the Iraq war. But after that, I think the people control the world. They realize that something has to be done. And they've taken various steps to weaken that sort of mass mobilization. But nonetheless, that's something that offers some hope. And that brings me to the point that Dr. Javad Zarif made about the individual, the role of individuals, the autonomy they can exercise, and so on. I think it is important, partly because of the new technologies and the way in which we can communicate with one another, like what we're doing now, what has happened for a number of years in different parts of the world. So I think these things are signs of hope here and there, where we can bring about some change, perhaps. But we should be realistic and at the same time be idealistic, because the idealism that is involved here is a better future for the whole of humankind. Overcoming some of these challenges, which are really a blot on the human conscience. They are blot upon our dignity as human beings. I see what's happening in Gaza as an example. A genocide that is so blatant, and yet we are not able to put a stop to it. Likewise, we look at things like poverty and growing gaps and all the rest of it, and increasing authoritarianism in democracies and non-democracies. These are things that we have to fight. And this is why I think the mobilization and the attempt to articulate an alternative, it has to go on and on. And, we have to encourage millions of voices to come forward and bring about the change that we desire. Thank you.